BBC London 94.9, it's 6 minutes past 7.
The Sands is proud to present a wonderful new show, A Man and His Music.
Mr. Crowley.
It's Gary Crowley on BBC London 94.9, and I'm very pleased to say that Brian Eno is in my company for the next 60 minutes. It's good to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you as well.
Because you're very busy at the moment, aren't you? I mean, I was listening to you on Charlie Gillett's programme a little while back, and I think I'm right in saying that over the past few weeks, few months, you've been working with everybody from Paul Simon to the boys from Travis, and also Grace Jones as well.
Yeah. And my favourite drummer ever, Tony Allen.
Yeah.
So he's working on Grace's record, or he came in for a couple of days. He's the father of modern music to me.
Yeah.
That's a big claim, but I think I could support it in a court of law.
So as far as, all of those sort of three artists are concerned, I mean, have you got the are you sat in the producer's chair at the moment, Brian, with all three of those people then, or is it...
No, in fact, I'm not with any of them, the producer. I've decided to rename my job. So I just join in helping to make the music, that's all. And some of it is what would normally be called being a producer, some of it is just playing, some of it is subverting the process in some way or another.
Yeah.
But I don't like the word producer. I don't want to be that.
You shy away from that.
It sounds like someone sitting in a chair, doesn't it? And that's not
with
what
a ruler.
I want to do. Yes, exactly.
You will do this. But what's your criteria, for working with people?
Well, I suppose it's more than whether I like their music or not. It's whether I think there's a convergence between what they're doing in their music and what I'm wanting to do in mine that would be fruitful for me as well. So I'm not just there to help them make their records. I'm there because I kind of imagine a kind of music that could exist that together we could make. So I'm sort of seeing it as a collaboration, really, when I'm working with people, not as a producer-client situation.
And what do you get from, the collaborative process as well after all this time? I mean, can you explain to me how it works? I mean, the boys from Travis, for instance, who we've had on the programme many times over the years, I mean, they would call you or the person that you look after, and what kind of happens after that then?
Well, they got in touch with me and said, would I be interested in working with them in some way? And I suppose they were thinking in terms of a producer in at first, but then I said, well, what sort of point are you at in the cycle of doing something? And they said, well, we're just starting to write songs again. And I said, okay, well, that's a really interesting place to be. That's what I would like to help with, to try to think of some ways of changing your habits, or some sort of exercises we could do that would take you places musically that you might not go naturally. And actually it's much easier for someone outside the group to suggest those things than somebody inside. Within a band there's always sort of roles that are already defined, and there are personality, habits and so on, and it's hard for somebody within the band to say, okay, today we're going to do this,
and shake up the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just not diplomatic, whereas if somebody from the outside comes in and says, okay, let's try an experiment today, here's a simple chord sequence, let's think of 10 different ways of approaching something like this, and really ways that we've never done it before. For example, one of the things we did was I asked each of them to think of their favourite song at the moment. What song do you really like at the moment, or what track are you listening to a lot? Okay, and then now each of you write down 5 adjectives describing that track. Things like aggressive, bright, whatever. And so then I wrote all those adjectives on separate little sheets of paper, shuffled them all up in a hat, and then each person took 2 of those out randomly, and then we started playing a chord sequence, but you had to play according to your 2 adjectives, whatever instrument you were on, you see. So one person
They shall remain nameless.
Yeah, well, you couldn't tell anyone what your adjectives were. You just had to play in the style that your 2 adjectives suggested, but you couldn't let anybody else know what they were. And it was very funny, because one person got 2 completely contradictory adjectives, which I believe were as contradictory as African and anti-African, or something like that. They were completely opposites. And I think that was the drummer, poor guy.
Neil.
Neil, yeah.
Well, we started this hour by going back to 1972, and I wanted to start with, Virginia Plain, the Roxy Music debut single, which which reached at number 4 back in August of that year. Very, very quickly, any sort of, kind of standout defining memories that you have of the recording, or perhaps, the writing of that song as well?
This song, yeah.
Yeah, such a seminal, sort of single.
Well, I remember Brian calling me late one evening. He lived in Chelsea and I lived in Maida Vale, and saying over the phone, "Hey, I've got this amazing song, listen to this." And he put the phone on top of the piano, and he's going like that, and singing that song. It sounded immediately like a hit. And funnily enough, very early on in the history of that song, even before we'd recorded it, I said, "I bet this will get to number 4 in the charts."
Did you really say that, honestly?
And I won the bet, because we all bet whether it was going to be a hit and where it would get to, and I said number 4, and I won the bet.
You were proven right. Well, it still sounds great. Let's pause for some music and bring it right up to date with a track from your new album, which is out now, Another Day on Earth. The single, this we're going to hear a little bit later on, and then we'll talk some more after we hear And Then So Clear from the new album. Gary Crowley on BBC London 94.9, and Brian Eno, my very, very special guest, and from the new album, which is out now. The title of the album is Another Day on Earth. That's a tune entitled And Then So Clear. How much do your songs evolve as far as the studio is concerned? A lot, I would imagine.
They don't exist outside the studio. Really, I make songs completely from, well, not completely, but I would say 85% of my songs originate from sitting in the studio and starting to play with things. So I don't often, sort of walking down the street, suddenly hear a song in my head. It has happened, actually, and I've occasionally dreamed songs and so on, but by and large, most of the music I record comes from me sitting there, starting to play with things and think, oh, that's rather an intriguing thing, and that's an amazing beat, with that kind of vocal over that kind of beat. I've never heard something like that before. So that's always where it starts from. I've never heard something like this, and somehow it interests me,
And how are you enjoying, sort of being back as far as, whatever you want to call it? I like to call it the pop fray or whatever, doing things like this, and, lots of interviews, and, stuff that I guess you normally wouldn't do, really, and certainly haven't done for a while as well. Do you enjoy this sort of side of things, or...?
Well, I do a lot of talking. Whichever part of my life I'm in, I'm always doing talking. I do quite a lot of lecturing, so I'm used to talking, and I don't find it a strain. I don't have to switch gears to do a radio interview like this, for example. So it's not that different. The only thing that's different about it is that I have to talk a lot more about me than I normally would, because normally if I'm doing lectures, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about some ideas.
Yeah.
And so I have to sort of turn the attention back onto myself, which sometimes I find a little bit annoying.
Yeah. Oh dear. Well, I've got a few questions coming up next to ask about you about yourself. But I'd love to give people, a taster of your background, because I think I'm right in saying that you were raised in Suffolk, weren't you? Mm-hmm. And was it American Forces Radio was an important early influence?
Well, we had. I grew up within 5 miles of 2 very big American air bases, and I think there were a total of 17,000 GIs on those 2 bases. And our little town was only 4,500, you see, so we were absolutely swamped by Americans. And it was a tiny little Suffolk market town with these enormous 50s Cadillacs.
Being driven around, yeah.
And getting stuck on every corner, you know. There were these tiny little streets, and there was always these bloody great huge pink cars that couldn't get round the corners. And all the locals, you damn bloody American, get a bloody car back. There's a lot of grumbling going on, as there always is in Suffolk. That's the sort of main characteristic of the Suffolk man, is to grumble incessantly. And but what it meant was that in this little town we had about 8 coffee bars. A huge number for such a small town.
So we're talking late 50s, early 60s, I'm guessing here.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I was born in 1948, so I sort of became aware of music, really, in about 1955, with the earliest doo-wop songs that were around. In fact, the first record I ever owned was the Silhouettes song, Get a Job, which I still think is a great song.
And what was it about that music, Brian, that you know, connected with this kid from, you know, this kind of small town, well, not even a town, I mean, a small village in Suffolk?
Yeah.
I mean, what was it about the music that struck, you know, a chord with you?
It was like music from outer space to me. I'd never heard anything like it, and I had no idea what its context was, who was making it, because of course there weren't music magazines then, or I never saw them, so there were no photographs of these people. Of course I knew who Elvis was and Little Richard and Buddy Holly, but most of the records I was buying were by very obscure doo-wop bands, and the strange thing is I didn't even realize they were mostly black people. It was years later. In fact, when I sold my whole record collection to Radio Atlanta, their first record collection was my collection. So when Radio Atlanta first started broadcasting, for the first 2 months, all I heard was my records.
Sounds great.
And it was only then that people drew it to my attention that I had only been buying black music for
American black music.
Black music. Yeah, and all, you know, sort of southern doo-wop and soul, basically early R&B. So that came as quite a surprise to me that I had such an intact musical taste.
And did that influence as well, I mean, you know, extend to all things Americana as well? I mean, you know, film and...
No, I wasn't interested in... No, I was not interested really in American films. No, it was just the music. And it was just the Afro-American music, really, that interested me. And it stood in very sharp contrast to what I was hearing in England, because very often, if something was a hit in America, they wouldn't sell that single there. They would get some awful English person to do a cover version of it. And these were so milky and sort of pathetic and weedy by comparison. The original things, you know, the Afro-American things sounded sort of passionate and harsh and sort of rough and raw, and then you'd get Craig Douglas's version of it,
which kind of powered into...
oh dear, it was terrible. It was like that powdered tea you get, you know, that just no force to it at all.
No competition. Well, let's pause for some more music if we can. News and Travel's on the way. Another example of what you can hear from Brian Eno's new album. The album's entitled Another Day on Earth. Bottom Liners. I mean, are you comfortable talking about the songs and
yeah,
you know, the inspiration for them? This one?
Bottom Liners is, well, the idea is people who think about the bottom line. You know, it starts with the words great lines of numbers. And it's about this notion that people gradually become reduced to data, to numbers, essentially. You know, as we quantify more and more, and we become our bank balances, essentially. So this is a sort of song from a hypothetical future where people have started to find that idea romantic, where being a bottom liner is something you become proud of, sort of thing. So a lot of these songs are from... In fact, I think a lot of the music I've done in my life has been based on the idea of imagining a future and then imagining the music that would exist in that future. If there was a world like that, this is the kind of music they would be listening to. So in that one you have a a very synthetic voice. It's my voice, but I put it through a machine that enabled me to resynthesize it with a slight change of gender. So it's now some sort of, rather androgynous semi-male, semi-female character who sings rather faultlessly. There's absolutely no errors of tuning because I've ironed them all out. And this is my version of a form of romance from the future.
Gary Crowley on BBC London 94.9, and Brian Eno is my very special guest, and that's the single from the new album being Another Day on Earth, which is out now. That's the single which is released on Monday. That's entitled this. I mean, I'm always fascinated to hear, the inspiration behind songs. Again, that one, Brian, I mean, can you kind of sort of remember?
Yes, I can remember this very well, because that whole song was actually made and finished in one day of continuous work.
Is that normal, or is that...
No, that's quite fast.
Right.
Usually, well, I often get quite a long way within a day on a song, so I know at the end of the day whether I've got something or not, but then I might continue working on it for months and even years. For instance, Bottom Liners, the one you played earlier, had no less than 6 years of work in it. It doesn't mean I worked on it every day, but I would put it away for a few months, come back and change something and so on. But this one, I started it in the morning, and it started very simply. I had another piece of music which had a spoken word text, a woman's voice on it, and I was just playing around on my DJ equipment. I've got all this DJ equipment that I can make loops on and change the tempo of things and so on. And I hit this little loop, which is the central loop of this particular song, and it has this word "this" just coming round and round. And I thought, that's very interesting. You can put anything after the word "this," and I just started making a list of things to follow the word "this." This land, this son, this daughter, and it developed very, very quickly from there. This peculiar rhythm that it has, which I don't really know where that comes from, but it was just an attempt to find the rhythm that was already in that strange little loop and to sort of locate it and define it a little bit better. It's a very peculiar beat, and it's, I suppose, one of the things that fascinated me about it is one of my sort of obsessions in songwriting is to try to make songs of different shapes, so it isn't like verse, chorus, middle eight, verse, chorus, chorus. But just to see what can you do with structure, how can you change things so that the song has its own shape and life, and you remember that as part of the nature of the song. And so in this one, the voice stays pretty much in one place, and then it has this big breakout at the end where it suddenly sets itself tragically free and crashes down into this kind of Geiger sound, counter sound at the end.
I was going to say, I mean, this album, I think, you've actually said, yourself that it's, your kind of first selection of songs in something like, 20, 25 years or something like that. What made, the time right to, to make an album like this again for you?
I keep listening to songs, I suppose. That's what it is. I would notice that the kind of music I make is not necessarily the same as the kind of music I listen to. In fact, what I listen to is generally either African, West African music, Arabic music, or gospel music. Those are really the main things that I listen to. Those are all musics that are sort of distinguished by their passion, I suppose, their sense of the surrender, the total surrender of the performers to the music as they're doing it. That's what you like about that music, when you feel the person just carried away by it, then you're carried as well. And that's always a sensation I've enjoyed in music. And of course, I've never stopped singing, even though I haven't necessarily committed the results to record. I've been a singer for all this time, in some sense, some loose sense of that word. And about 6 years ago, actually, Bottom Liners was really the beginning of this. I just started playing around with things you could do with voices now that you couldn't in the past. And I like the fact that you could change voices, and so that you could break that connection between the personality of the guy who was doing the singing and the personality of the voice in the song. As I've done on several of these things, I've created, even though originally it's my voice, I've created another character. So it's quite clear that's not Brian Eno. This is some other new character. So I think what twigged with me is that you could take the position of being like a playwright, where you create a little play and then you invent a character who lives in that play. And so with these songs, I was always thinking of writing a character. Okay, so I'm the original source of that character's voice, but it isn't meant to be me. It's not autobiographical.
And what was it like for you as well, you know, kind of returning to, you know, that sort of way of songwriting, I guess, in the sort of, you know, traditional sense after all this time as well? I mean, was it difficult?
It is quite difficult, because there are very high standards for songwriting. You know, there are a lot of good songwriters around. There's a lot of songs around, basically. Now, in the other kind of music I had been involved in, it was pretty much my territory. There wasn't anybody else in there. I invented it, and I owned it, that little piece of landscape. And so, naturally, I was the best at it. There wasn't anyone else doing it. So to throw yourself back into the world of songwriting, especially when, as I have, you've worked with some of the world's best songwriters, it's quite difficult, because you're very aware that there are a lot of tricks up people's sleeves that you don't know about. So it's difficult from that point of view. It's thrilling when you think you've got it right, because there is something about song that connects with people that no other kind of music does. You know, song, whether the voice is synthetic or passionate and sincere or ironic or whatever it is, you know, even the Kraftwerk songs where the voices are deliberately as robotic as possible, they're still voices, and you still respond to them as beings that are saying something, that are in a predicament of some kind. So there's a lot of power in the song form, and there's a lot of danger.
Well, let's give people another example of what they can expect from the new album. Can you tell us a little bit about the song Just Another Day?
Yes, so this sort of became the title, though it wasn't originally the title track. The title of the album came from this song. This song has a sort of, to me, a lovely feeling of floating over a planet and looking down at it, and just seeing just the seething activity of humanity at work, doing all their different things, and fighting and making love and buying and selling and thinking and dreaming and forgetting and losing and gaining and all the other things that humans are doing. It's a little bit like, you know, looking into an ant's nest and seeing all that activity going on. And I want to give that a feeling of some sort of serenity to it, even though it's a turmoil. It's still, in the long term, in the long view, it's beautiful, and it's sort of working out all right. I suppose the message of all gospel music is everything's gonna be all right, and I love gospel music for that. It doesn't matter that they're singing about God and I'm an atheist. It doesn't matter at all. It's not about God as far as I'm concerned. It's about the feeling that things could work out, and this song is, I think, about the feeling that things could work out.
Gary Crowley on BBC London 94.9, and Brian Eno is my very special guest, and another example of what you can hear from the man's new collection of songs, which is out now. That's entitled Just Another Day, and the title of the album again is Another Day on Earth. I mean, we started this 1 hour special by playing Roxy from all those years ago. Was it always, as far as you were concerned, going to be a sort of a short-term stay? I mean, because you were only with them for, it was 2 albums, wasn't it?
2 albums, yeah. Well, you know, I have to say it's so peculiar how unconscious I was about everything then. For a start, I never thought I was going to end up being in a band. I studied painting, you know, and in fact painting and art history was what interested me. And then, kind of by accident, I ended up in this band. I was very interested in pop music, but I couldn't play anything.
You're a big Who fan, I think I'm right in
that's
saying
right.
at the beginning, weren't you? Yeah.
Who were a very big influence on me. And in fact, I studied under the same group of art teachers as Pete Townsend did, funnily enough.
What, would you have been at Ealing Art School?
Well, he was at Ealing, and then all of those staff got fired from Ealing, and they went on to Ipswich, which was where I went. So I knew all the same tutors, actually, and I'm sure had many of the same influences as he did. So I ended up in this band, Roxy Music, and sort of to my surprise, it became a big success. I didn't really expect that, because we were quite out there. We were off to one side of things, you know. I didn't really think that many people were going to like us.
I mean, that first Top of the Pops performance, which I can still remember, and you see it every now and then, you know, repeated on, you know, Top of the Pops too. But I mean, nobody looked like you guys, you know, before.
No.
I mean, you know, you described, you know, the music, the doo-wop, the rock and roll music that you heard as a kid being otherworldly. I mean, God, if there was any other band that, you know, was otherworldly, it was definitely Roxy Music, and I think personally,
yeah.
I mean, did you actually kind of sort of realise at the time as well, Brian, that you were, you know, kind of pushing back the sort of, you know, the boundaries, not only as far as the sounds of the records were concerned, but also, you know, the way that you looked as well?
Yes, I think we were actually more conscious of it in the way we looked and our approach to performance, because you have to remember that we came out of a context. The previous 4 or 5 years, it had been a kind of idea that musicians should be so into their instruments that they just stood on stage in kind of
sort of shoegazing, wasn't it?
Yeah, shoegazing.
Yeah.
And dirty clothes and sort of back to the audience, because I'm so into the music I can't even remember that there's an audience there. And we very much wanted to make something that was a weird and amazing show, something that people would just have their eyes knocked out by. So we were very conscious of the visual aspect. Now the music, of course, we rehearsed for such a long time, the same few songs. We'd meet 2 or 3 times a week.
Here in London?
Yeah, in my flat often in Camberwell. And we'd just work over these songs over and over and over again. So by the time the record came out, they all sounded pretty old hat to me. I thought, oh, this is so normal. People are going to think this is really normal. And I honestly did think that it just sounded a little bit safe by the time it was released. And it's funny, I listened to the first Roxy album a couple of weeks ago, and I suddenly think I heard it as other people might have heard it at the time. I thought, bloody hell, that is really far out, some of this stuff.
And I've got to ask this as well, but I mean, I hear that, you know, they're going back into the studio to record an album. I mean, somebody mentioned to me that you might be doing something on that. Is there any truth in that, or is that...
Well, I wrote a song for Brian about 4 years ago for his last album, which the song turned out beautifully. I was very pleased with it. And I love his voice, so when I sort of was writing this song, I was thinking, this is a song Brian could sing. And I had a couple of others, actually, which I thought these could also be songs Brian could sing. So I don't really want to work live or anything like that.
But maybe in the studio.
Well, I'm not even sure about that, but I'd be very happy if they felt like doing these songs.
Yeah.
They're songs that, one of them in particular, I think Brian could do a fabulous job on. So I've given them a CD with these 4 songs on it. There's 4 actually on the CD. 2 of them are a bit sort of long shots, but 2 of them I think are very...
Well, there could be an EP there, at least.
An EP? Why doesn't anyone do that anymore?
I know. Perfect, you know?
Yeah.
Not a single, but not an album. I mean, look, I mean, you know, you've
That's
had...
a good idea, Gary, an EP.
Well, look into it. Yeah.
I think that's very nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, people don't make EPs anymore, do they? But
Everybody thinks they've got so much to say that they have to make an album.
I know, and sometimes
Many
that
albums
isn't the
would be
case.
better
Yeah,
as EPs.
definitely. I mean, we spoke a little bit earlier on about you working with Travis, and I know that you've also been working with Paul Simon as well, and we also mentioned Grace Jones as well. I mean, you've worked with such an amazing roll call of artists, Brian. I mean, U2, Talking Heads, David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, John Cowell, Cluster as well. I mean, as far as people out there who you would perhaps haven't had this sort of the chance to kind of meet or collaborate with yet, I mean, are there any sort of obvious ones that you would love to kind of get into a studio with and do something with, or do you
Yes.
sort of think of it like
Well, I sometimes in my fantasies I imagine bands I would like to put together to go into a studio.
your
with.
supergroup?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. So I imagine Tony Allen on drums. He was the drummer for Fela Kuti for the whole Afrobeat thing. And then I imagine Michelle Ndegeocello on bass, and probably also singing, actually. She's so brilliant. She could probably... Actually, that would probably be enough there. That would be far too much to handle already. And then maybe I would have Leo Abrahams, who's on this record a lot, on guitar. He's a very creative and fascinating guitarist, as is the other guy, Steve Jones. In fact, the two of them together would be a whole new world of guitar playing. Then I might have Linda Kennis, who was Linda Thompson from Richard and Linda Thompson. Oh, but Richard on guitar, that would be great as well.
Sounds like you've got an orchestra in the making
Yes.
here, Brian. Yeah.
No, I often think of what combinations of people would make amazing results,
Yeah.
and I think particularly Tony Allen and Michelle Ndegeocello would be one of the great rhythm section actually of
Yeah.
all time.
Well, I think listening to this album as well. I mean, you mentioned again, listening to those early doo-wop records, courtesy of the American, radio stations up there in Suffolk back in the day, about them being sort of otherworldly. I think this has got a wonderful sort of that same quality to it as well.
Good, thank
So I mean, I've really enjoyed it, and it's been lovely seeing you as well, and meeting you properly. We're going to end with Caught Between. Again, sort of any sort of stories behind the writing or recording of this song?
This is one of the older ones as well, in that it started quite a long time ago, and like many songs, most of it came together in a few hours, and the rest of it took years.